What happens when your own daughter-in-law forbids you from seeing your beloved grandchildren? Margaret refused to accept it, and took the fight all the way to court. What happened next left the whole family in shock. Margaret always considered her family the center of her world. Ever since her husband passed away, the bonds with her son Michael and his two children, Ella and Ben, had become the thread that held her days together. Every Friday, she'd pick up her grandkids from school, bring them home for cookies and cartoons, and listen to their stories about friends, teachers, and dreams for the future. Those moments were her anchor. But the harmony began to crack when Michael remarried. His new wife, Vanessa, was charming on the surface, always gracious at family dinners, bringing thoughtful gifts, complimenting Margaret's garden. Yet beneath the smiles, Margaret sensed a distance, a guardedness in the way Vanessa handled the children or answered questions about their schedules. The first sign of trouble came quietly. One afternoon, Margaret arrived at the school only to find Vanessa already waiting, her car idling by the curb. "Oh, I decided to get them today," Vanessa said, her smile tight. Margaret tried to hide her surprise. The next week, Vanessa texted at the last minute to cancel their usual Friday. "The kids are tired, let's skip this week," she wrote, adding a smiley face as if to soften the blow. As the weeks went by, the missed visits became more frequent. Margaret found herself standing in her kitchen, phone in hand, reading polite but vague messages from Vanessa. "We have plans. The kids have homework. Maybe next week." The excuses piled up, and Margaret's heart grew heavier with each one. Michael seemed oblivious. When Margaret finally broached the subject, he sounded distracted. "Vanessa's just busy, Mom. The kids are fine." But Margaret saw how Ella's drawings disappeared from her fridge, how Ben's laughter faded from her hallway. She tried not to let resentment creep in, but each Friday felt emptier than the last. Determined to bridge the gap, Margaret baked Vanessa's favorite lemon loaf and brought it over as a peace offering. Vanessa accepted it with a polite thank you, but the children were nowhere to be seen. "They're upstairs resting," she explained. Margaret tried to suggest a visit to the park, but Vanessa replied, "Maybe another day, they have a lot on their plate." Her words, though polite, left no room for argument. One Sunday, during a rare family dinner, Margaret watched as Vanessa directed every conversation, choosing what the kids could eat, how long they could watch TV, even which stories they could tell. Michael seemed content to defer to his wife, rarely intervening. Ella sat quietly, glancing at her grandmother with sad eyes, while Ben barely touched his food. Later that week, Margaret attended Ella's school play alone. She spotted Vanessa in the audience, but when she tried to wave, Vanessa turned away. At intermission, Margaret waited by the exit, hoping to say hello, but Vanessa left quickly, ushering the children out with barely a glance. Hurt and bewildered, Margaret confided in her friend Louise. "It's like I'm being erased from their lives," she whispered over coffee, hands trembling. Louise frowned. "You have rights, Margaret. You can't just be cut out." But Margaret hesitated. She didn't want conflict. She just wanted her family back. The situation worsened. Vanessa began blocking Margaret's calls and texts. When Margaret sent birthday gifts for the children, they were returned, unopened, with a note, "Please respect our wishes. The kids need stability." The words stung like a slap. Michael's responses grew shorter, more distant. "It's not a good time, Mom. Let's not make this harder." Margaret's health began to suffer. She lost sleep, barely ate, and spent her days replaying memories of laughter in her garden. Friends urged her to see a lawyer, but she resisted. "I can't take my own family to court," she insisted. Yet the ache of separation became unbearable. One day, while visiting her doctor for a checkup, Margaret broke down in tears. The doctor listened patiently, then asked, "Have you tried mediation? There are laws to protect grandparents, you know." The idea seemed radical, but as Margaret left the office, a spark of hope flickered inside her. She owed it to Ella and Ben, to herself, not to give up. That night, Margaret wrote a letter to Michael, pouring out her heart. She described the pain of missing birthdays, the longing to share her love, the fear of being forgotten. She asked for a meeting, a chance to talk, face to face. The following week, Michael agreed to meet her at a small cafe. Margaret arrived early, rehearsing her words. But as Michael entered, his face was tight with worry. "Vanessa doesn't want you seeing the kids," he said quietly. She thinks it's confusing for them. She doesn't want outside influences. Margaret's heart broke, but a steely resolve took hold. I love them, Michael. I have a right to be in their lives. If this is the only way, I'll fight. As she left the cafe, Margaret's hands trembled, but her steps were sure. The fight for her family had begun. Margaret's decision set her life on a new, daunting course. The next morning, she stood in her kitchen, the letter from her doctor still folded in her purse, and stared at her phone, heart pounding. It took several tries before she found the courage to dial the number Louise had given her, a local law firm with a reputation for handling family disputes discreetly. Harper, Blake and Kimball, said the receptionist, her tone brisk but kind. Margaret stumbled through her explanation, her voice shaking as she described her predicament. The receptionist assured her someone would call back soon. Margaret spent the day on edge, unable to focus on anything. She dusted the shelves, sorted through old photo albums of Ella and Ben, sticky fingers, grinning faces, summer afternoons in the backyard. She tried to knit, but her hands trembled too much to manage even a simple scarf. Every sound, the phone, the mail slot, footsteps outside, made her flinch. That afternoon, the lawyer called. Ms. Wallace, this is Deborah Kimball. I understand you're facing visitation issues with your grandchildren. Margaret swallowed, steadying herself. Yes. My daughter-in-law. She shut me out completely. Deborah's questions were practical but gentle. When did it begin? Was there a written record of her attempts to visit? Any witnesses or returned gifts? Margaret answered as thoroughly as she could, describing every cancelled Friday, every unopened present, every phone call blocked or ignored. Deborah explained the basics of family law, how, in their state, grandparents had certain legal rights, especially when a relationship with the grandchildren was long established. The courts will always consider the children's best interests. You'll need documentation, texts, emails, returned gifts, even photographs of you with Ella and Ben. Margaret felt a surge of hope and fear. Deborah suggested mediation as a first step, but warned that if Vanessa refused, a formal petition might be necessary. Margaret began gathering evidence, filling a box with birthday cards, photographs, letters, and even her diary, where she'd meticulously recorded every missed visit. She scrolled through old emails, printing out conversations with Michael and even Vanessa from happier times. She felt both detective and defendant, building a case for the love she never thought would need defending. The next week, Deborah filed a request for mediation. Margaret waited anxiously for a response. Michael was silent, but Vanessa replied to Deborah's letter almost immediately, a curt refusal, claiming Margaret's unpredictable behavior made her a disruptive influence. The children need consistency, she wrote. We cannot allow her to undermine our parenting. Margaret's hands shook with anger and disbelief. Undermine. She'd never done anything but love and support her family. Deborah reassured her. This is sadly common. Don't respond. Let us handle the communication from here. Margaret agreed, though the urge to call Michael or send a letter was overwhelming. As the case moved forward, word began to spread among Margaret's friends. Some were supportive, offering advice, sympathy, or simply a shoulder to cry on. Others cautioned her. Courts are slow and expensive, Margaret. Are you sure you want to put the children in the middle? She agonized over the risks, but every night, she looked at the empty chairs around her kitchen table and felt the hole in her heart. One morning, Margaret received a notice. The court had scheduled a preliminary hearing in 3 weeks. The document was official, stamped and signed, with a date circled in red by Deborah's assistant. Margaret's nerves threatened to undo her, but Louise rallied to her side. You're standing up for love, Margaret. Don't let fear take the wheel. As the hearing approached, Margaret met with Deborah several times, reviewing every detail of her relationship with Ella and Ben. They built a timeline, weekly visits, school plays, birthday parties, doctor's notes about her health, even statements from neighbors who'd seen the children laughing in her garden. Deborah explained how the court would look for evidence that Margaret's presence was beneficial to the children. You've been part of their world for years, Deborah said. That counts for a lot. The night before the hearing, Margaret barely slept. She walked the halls of her house, brushing her fingers over framed photos, reciting each memory aloud. Ella's first bike ride, Ben's piano recital, rainy afternoons spent building forts from sofa cushions. She whispered promises into the dark. "I will not let you go." On the day of the hearing, Margaret dressed with care, a navy dress, pearl earrings, and the locket that Ella had given her for Christmas 2 years before. Louise drove her to the courthouse, offering comfort and quiet strength. Deborah met them at the door, her presence steady and unflappable. Inside, the courthouse bustled with nervous energy. Margaret spotted Vanessa across the waiting area, her expression cold and triumphant, Michael at her side, face drawn with tension. When their names were called, Margaret felt her knees shake, but she stood tall. The judge listened intently as Deborah laid out the facts. Margaret's deep involvement in her grandchildren's lives, the abrupt and total cutoff, the returned gifts, the emotional pain. Vanessa's lawyer painted Margaret as meddling and overbearing, accusing her of trying to control Michael's family. Michael said little, eyes on the floor. When the judge asked if Margaret wanted to speak, her heart pounded. She spoke of love, of family, of reading bedtime stories and baking cookies, of the children's laughter and the ache of their absence. Her voice was clear, every word heavy with longing and resolve. Afterward, Margaret left the courthouse drained but strangely lighter. For the first time in months, she'd been able to say, in public and on record, what her family meant to her. The decision was yet to come, but Margaret knew, no matter the outcome, she had finally stood up for her place in her grandchildren's lives. The days after the hearing stretched long and tense, every ring of the phone making Margaret's heart leap. She threw herself into her routines to stave off worry, walking to the market each morning, tending her roses, and scribbling anxious notes in her diary. Friends checked in often. Louise came by with a casserole, Ruth with a fresh loaf of bread, both determined to keep Margaret from feeling too alone. Still, nothing filled the empty space left by Ella and Ben. Meanwhile, the legal wheels turned. Deborah, her lawyer, called regularly with updates. "The judge requested more information from both sides," she explained one afternoon. "We need statements from teachers, neighbors, anyone who can testify about your role in the children's lives." Margaret gathered her courage and made a list. Ella's third-grade teacher, Mr. Nolan, who'd once called Margaret the class's unofficial grandma for volunteering at school events. Mrs. Cohen, her neighbor, who'd watched the children grow up in Margaret's garden. Even the pastor from their old church. Over the next week, Margaret reached out, one call at a time. Each conversation was a small battle with her pride, but the support she received was overwhelming. "Of course I'll write a letter," Mrs. Cohen insisted. Mr. Nolan remembered fondly how Margaret had sat through every school concert and field trip, always with a smile and a packed lunch for Ella and Ben. The pastor promised to speak to Deborah directly. With every call, Margaret felt a little less isolated, a little more hopeful. Meanwhile, Vanessa dug in her heels. Deborah forwarded copies of emails and affidavits from Vanessa's attorney, each one painting Margaret as a destabilizing force in the children's lives. Vanessa claimed Margaret criticized their parenting, undermined Michael's authority, and created emotional confusion. Margaret felt the sting of every accusation. She paced her living room, reliving every encounter, questioning whether a misunderstood comment or a worried glance could be twisted against her. Michael, for his part, remained silent. When Margaret tried calling him, she reached only voicemail. She left messages, short, pleading, hopeful, but he never called back. The ache of her son's absence was almost worse than missing her grandchildren. As the evidence mounted, Deborah scheduled a second mediation session. This time, Vanessa attended with her lawyer, sitting stiff-backed across the table. Margaret, dressed in her best blouse, held her ground. The mediator asked simple, direct questions. "What do you want? Why is this so important?" Margaret spoke honestly, her words full of longing and pain. "I'm not trying to interfere. I just want to be a grandmother to the children I love." Vanessa's responses were clipped. "They're settled now. I don't want them confused. Margaret makes things harder for all of us." Her lawyer added that familial boundaries were essential, and Margaret's visits created unnecessary disruption. Despite the tension, Margaret stayed calm. She remembered Deborah's advice. Don't take the bait. Stick to the facts. Show the court you're steady, reliable, and devoted. After the session, Margaret sat in the park, staring at a playground where other children ran and shrieked, their grandparents cheering from nearby benches. The ache in her chest was almost physical. She found herself scribbling a letter to Ella and Ben, tucking it away in her purse, a promise to herself that she'd never stop fighting for them. In the following days, support from the community grew. The local librarian, who'd seen Margaret bring the children in for summer reading programs, offered to testify. Neighbors brought over homemade cards, one with a photo of Ben at last year's block party, laughing in Margaret's lap. She added every letter, every card, every email to her swelling case file. Meanwhile, the court ordered a social worker to visit both homes, to observe and report on the children's well-being and family relationships. Margaret readied her house, dusted every corner, baked cookies just in case. When the social worker arrived, a young woman named Tessa, Margaret greeted her with quiet dignity. She showed Tessa the children's old room, still filled with their favorite books and toys, the wall where she'd marked their heights in pencil. Tessa asked careful questions. How do you usually spend time with Ella and Ben? What would you like for them? Margaret answered with truth and warmth, describing the games, the stories, the love and stability she'd always provided. Tessa took notes, nodded, and promised her report would be fair. By week's end, Margaret felt the exhaustion of battle pressing on her. But as she walked through her garden, she noticed the first buds of spring, tiny, green, defiant. She paused, took a breath, and reminded herself, she had not come this far to give up now. The days leading to the next court date were a whirlwind of preparation. Margaret's kitchen became her war room, papers, statements, and community letters stacked in careful piles. Louise came over every afternoon to help, reading witness statements aloud while Margaret organized them in a binder Deborah had provided. Ruth and Mrs. Cohen arrived with encouragement and home-cooked meals, insisting Margaret focus on the task at hand. One morning, Deborah called with news. The judge had requested in-person testimony from several witnesses. Margaret's hands trembled as she called Mr. Nolan, the schoolteacher, and the librarian, both of whom agreed to appear without hesitation. Mrs. Cohen, fiercely loyal, declared, "I'll march in there myself and tell them what a wonderful grandmother you are." Margaret felt both humbled and fortified by their support. Each time she doubted herself, Louise reminded her, "You're not just fighting for yourself, you're fighting for every grandparent who's been pushed aside." Meanwhile, Vanessa's camp grew more defensive. Vanessa instructed her attorney to submit affidavits from her own friends, parents from school and acquaintances, describing Margaret as overbearing and intrusive. The descriptions stung. Deborah, however, was unfazed. The court will look at patterns, not isolated complaints. Stick to the facts. The social worker's second visit was more formal. Tessa brought forms, questions, and a quiet air of authority. She toured Margaret's home again, noticing the updated calendar on the fridge marked with birthdays, recitals, and the children's favorite outings. Margaret showed her the garden, pointing out the spots where Ella had planted tulip bulbs and Ben had chased butterflies. The house felt alive with their absence, every room a testament to years of shared memories. Tessa asked about Margaret's health, support system, and how she would handle any disagreements with Michael and Vanessa. Margaret answered carefully, emphasizing her willingness to respect boundaries, her desire for peaceful family relations, and her commitment to putting the children's needs first. After Tessa left, Margaret collapsed into a chair, heart pounding. Louise made her tea, and the two women sat in companionable silence. "You're doing everything you can," Louise finally said. "The truth will speak for itself." As the court date approached, Margaret found herself replaying the children's voices in her mind, Ben's infectious giggle, Ella's whispered secrets during sleepovers. She wrote each memory in her diary, anchoring herself to the love that had sparked this fight. On the morning of the hearing, Deborah arrived early to review last-minute details. She ran through the witness list, outlined possible questions, and practiced with Margaret the answers she might need to give. "Stay calm. Let them see you as the loving, stable person you are. Don't let Vanessa's lawyer get under your skin." At court, the gallery was fuller than before. Michael and Vanessa sat together, Vanessa's posture stiff, Michael's gaze flickering with nerves. Margaret's friends clustered in the back row, nodding encouragement as she entered. The proceedings began with the judge's questions, probing the timeline and the reasons for the sudden estrangement. Deborah presented Margaret's case clearly, referencing letters, community testimony, and Tessa's preliminary report. Margaret felt her pulse race as each witness took the stand. Mr. Nolan spoke about Margaret's role at the school, highlighting her dependability and warmth. The librarian described the hours Margaret spent encouraging the children to read. Mrs. Cohen described family picnics and the joy Margaret brought to the neighborhood. Each statement was a thread in the tapestry Margaret hoped the judge would see, a portrait of unwavering love and reliability. When Vanessa's witnesses spoke, their testimony was colder, brief descriptions of over-involvement, stories of Margaret correcting the children's manners or offering unsolicited advice. Vanessa's lawyer pressed Deborah, hinting that Margaret wanted to undermine parental authority. Deborah responded with calm, steering the conversation back to the children's best interests and Margaret's willingness to respect boundaries. Then, Margaret was called to testify. She spoke softly but firmly, her voice growing stronger as she recounted birthday parties, school plays, and afternoons spent reading in the garden. She described the ache of their absence, the steps she'd taken to mend the rift, and her hope that the court would help rebuild what had been lost. As she stepped down, Margaret caught Michael's eye. For a moment, she saw the boy he'd once been, the son who used to hold her hand and beg for just one more story. Her resolve deepened. The judge announced that a final decision would be made after reviewing all the testimony and the social worker's full report. Margaret left the courtroom exhausted, but filled with a cautious hope. Her friends gathered around, enveloping her in hugs. "No matter what happens," Ruth whispered, "you've shown them who you are." That night, Margaret sat on her porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the stars. The battle was not over, but she felt lighter than she had in months. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine Ella and Ben running up the walkway again, laughter ringing through the air. In the days following the hearing, Margaret's home was filled with both tension and hope. She moved through her daily routines with a new intensity, waiting for any news from Deborah or the court. Each morning, she checked her phone before her feet touched the floor, hoping for an update. The house seemed quieter than ever. The children's laughter and footsteps were still only memories echoing in her heart. To fill the restless hours, Margaret threw herself into projects she'd once shared with Ella and Ben. She weeded the garden, mended Ben's favorite quilt, and polished the old wooden chess set they'd played with on rainy afternoons. Louise, Ruth, and Mrs. Cohen continued their steady visits, bringing not just food but stories, games, and encouragement. "You're the bravest grandmother I know," Ruth told her, squeezing her hand. "Win or lose, you showed your family, and this whole town, what love looks like." One afternoon, Deborah called with important news. "The judge has requested a final in-depth interview with you, and the social worker wants to observe your home during a typical afternoon. This is your chance, Margaret. Show them your world, your heart." Margaret nodded, her nerves jangling but her resolve strong. On the appointed day, Margaret prepared with care. She baked chocolate chip cookies, arranged family photos along the mantel, and set out the children's favorite board games in the living room. She even laid out the old art supplies Ella loved, colored pencils, thick paper, and a half-finished sketchbook she'd left behind last summer. The social worker, Tessa, arrived first. Margaret greeted her warmly and led her through each room, pointing out family memories and favorite traditions. "Ella and Ben always helped me pick fresh herbs for dinner," she said in the kitchen, "and every Sunday we'd make pancakes in silly shapes." Tessa listened attentively, taking notes and smiling as Margaret recounted story after story. Soon after, the judge arrived, an older woman with kind eyes but a measured demeanor. Margaret offered her tea, which the judge accepted, then sat across from her in the sun-filled living room. "Tell me what these children mean to you," the judge asked, her voice gentle but direct. Margaret spoke from the heart. She described birthday mornings spent baking cakes together, autumn walks through the park, and late nights spent comforting the children after bad dreams. She recounted Ben's shy questions about the world, Ella's excitement about school projects, the way both children would curl up in her lap and beg for just one more story. Her voice trembled only once, when she admitted, "My life is richer because of them. I just want to keep loving them." The judge nodded, occasionally glancing at Tessa's notes. She asked Margaret how she'd handle disagreements with Vanessa in the future. Margaret answered honestly, describing her promise to respect their home and routines, her willingness to support Michael and Vanessa as parents, and her desire to always put the children's happiness first. As the visit ended, the judge paused in the doorway, turning to Margaret. "You've given me a lot to think about. Thank you for sharing your home and your heart with me today." After she left, Tessa stayed behind a moment, reassuring Margaret. "You did beautifully. You showed them exactly who you are." The days that followed were a test of patience. Margaret called Deborah nearly every afternoon, searching for reassurance. Deborah explained that the court was reviewing all witness statements, the social worker's observations, and the judge's own impressions. "It's all in the court's hands now," she said. Margaret coped by writing letters to Ella and Ben, pages filled with memories, encouragement, and love, tucking them away in her desk for a day she hoped would come. She found comfort in her friends, who joined her for a small picnic in the backyard, recalling happier summers and filling the air with laughter and hope. One evening, as she watched the sun dip behind the rooftops, Margaret's phone rang. It was Michael. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, in a voice thick with emotion, Michael whispered, "Mom, I'm sorry for all of this. I never wanted it to go this far." Margaret listened as he apologized, his voice raw and honest. He admitted he missed her, and so did the kids. When the call ended, Margaret sat in stunned silence, tears rolling down her cheeks. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to hope, truly hope, that the bonds of family might still be mended. The next week unfolded in a strange limbo, hope and anxiety swirling through every moment. Margaret replayed Michael's phone call in her mind, his voice wavering between regret and longing. She yearned for a second conversation, but days passed with no new word. Louise and Ruth tried to distract her with baking sessions and card games, but Margaret found it hard to focus, her thoughts always drifting back to Ella and Ben. Finally, on Friday, a letter from the court arrived. Deborah phoned almost immediately, voice steady. "The judge has requested a final hearing. All parties must attend, and the children will be interviewed privately." Margaret felt her heart leap and sink at once. She wondered how Ella and Ben would handle questions from a stranger, and prayed they remembered the warmth and laughter of their days together. The days leading up to the hearing were a blur of nervous preparations. Deborah reviewed possible questions and reminded Margaret to remain calm and truthful, no matter what Vanessa's lawyer tried. "Your love and stability speak for themselves," she reassured. Margaret reread her own testimony, revisited every memory she might need to call upon, and found comfort in the letters and drawings she'd collected over the years. On the morning of the hearing, Margaret dressed carefully, choosing her softest sweater and the locket with Ella and Ben's photo inside. At the courthouse, she spotted Michael and Vanessa across the hall. Vanessa was tense, her jaw set, while Michael looked tired, avoiding his mother's eyes. Deborah squeezed Margaret's hand as they entered the courtroom. The judge began by summarizing the evidence. Years of shared family life, the sudden rupture, the flood of testimony from teachers, neighbors, and friends. Margaret listened, hands clasped tightly in her lap, as Deborah presented her closing arguments, describing not just the legal rights of grandparents, but the emotional loss suffered by children and elders alike when families are fractured. Then, for the first time, the judge invited Ella and Ben to speak privately in chambers. Margaret caught a brief glimpse of her grandchildren, Ella clutching a notebook, Ben holding a small toy dinosaur. They vanished into the judge's office, the door closing softly behind them. While they waited, Vanessa's lawyer pressed Margaret on her willingness to cooperate, demanding to know if she'd truly respect boundaries and defer to Michael and Vanessa's authority. Margaret answered with quiet resolve, promising to always support the parents' rules, to work through any future disagreements with grace, and above all, to put the children's needs first. When Ella and Ben finally returned, their faces were unreadable. Margaret wanted to run to them, to hold them close and reassure them, but all she could do was offer a trembling smile. The judge then invited final words from both sides. Vanessa's voice trembled as she insisted she was only protecting her family from unnecessary confusion. Michael spoke hesitantly, voice barely above a whisper. "My mother has always been there for my kids. I know she means well. I want what's best for them. I want peace." Court adjourned with the judge promising a written decision soon. Margaret left the courthouse drained, her chest tight but her head held high. Deborah assured her, "You did everything right. Now let the judge see the truth." That night, Margaret sat with Louise and Ruth on her porch, sharing tea and silent support. The stars above seemed to promise comfort, and for the first time in months, Margaret allowed herself a fragile smile. The battle for her family was nearly over, her love and truth laid bare for all to see. The days after the final hearing crept by with agonizing slowness. Margaret threw herself into routine to keep the anxiety at bay, filling her hours with small but necessary tasks. She tended her garden with renewed care, planted new bulbs, and swept the walkways as if clearing her mind with every motion. Ruth and Louise made sure she was never alone for long, inviting her for lunches and walks, listening patiently as she wondered aloud how Ella and Ben had felt speaking to the judge. On the third afternoon, Michael appeared at her door. Margaret's heart thudded as she opened it, not knowing what to expect. He stood awkwardly on the porch, hands deep in his jacket pockets, face drawn and uncertain. "Mom, can I come in?" She nodded and led him to the kitchen, where she poured tea without a word. They sat together in the quiet, steam curling between their cups. Finally, Michael spoke. "I wanted to say I'm sorry again. I never wanted things to get so bad. I miss the way things were." His voice faltered. "I miss you. I know the kids do too." Margaret reached across the table, her hand gentle but firm. "It didn't have to be like this, Michael. All I ever wanted was to love them, and you." Michael nodded, shame flickering in his eyes. "Vanessa's afraid. She thinks if we let you back in, she'll lose control. But I told her you're part of this family, whether she likes it or not." For the first time in months, Margaret saw a glimpse of the son she remembered, the one who once came to her with every scraped knee and broken heart. "The judge said we'll get the decision this week," he added quietly. "Whatever happens, I want to try and fix things. For Ella and Ben. For all of us." After Michael left, Margaret sat for a long time at the kitchen table, gratitude and sorrow twisting together inside her. She wrote another letter to Ella and Ben, tucking it away in the hope that one day soon they might read it with her by their side. That evening, the community's support deepened. Mrs. Cohen brought over a tray of lasagna. The local librarian called to ask if Margaret would consider reading to children again at summer programs. Even the pastor stopped by, leaving a handwritten note, "You taught us all about forgiveness and perseverance." The next morning, Deborah called. "The judge's decision is coming tomorrow, Margaret. Be ready." Margaret barely slept that night, her thoughts racing, her dreams full of the children's laughter. The following day dawned gray and damp. Margaret waited by the window, watching for the postman. Just before noon, a thick envelope appeared in her mailbox. Deborah called within minutes. "I have it too. I'll be right over." They opened the envelope together at the kitchen table. Deborah read aloud, her voice steady. The judge's words were clear and measured, reviewing every piece of evidence, every witness, every heartfelt testimony. As Deborah read, Margaret gripped her teacup, her entire world hanging on each word. Louise and Ruth arrived and stood at her side, hands on her shoulders, as the conclusion drew near. Margaret felt as if she were holding her breath for a lifetime, waiting for the words that would define her family's future.